July 14, 2026. 9:23 a.m. Savannah, Georgia, Gate 7, Garden City Terminal. A 40-foot container rode the last leg of a standard inbound sweep, moving through the radiation portal at walking pace. The CBP officer monitoring the density console had run this same sequence 1,100 times in the past 8 months. He knew the profiles: steel machinery, dense, irregular; timber light, even; industrial bearings, predictable, consistent. The readout for container MSKU 4471823 was not consistent, 6% above the declared mass. On a 40-foot load of precision bearing assemblies, body camera footage shows agents pulling units off the pallet one by one, stacking them on a forensic scale. The numbers climbed. No clerical rounding error produces this. The manifest had no explanation for what the scale was reading. The officer flagged it for secondary. That decision, made in under 4 seconds, would set off a federal operation spanning 5 states, 5 weeks, and 2 simultaneous warrant executions that dismantled one of the most precisely engineered sanctions evasion pipelines HSI had seen in the post-2022 enforcement era. 592 restricted marine diesel fuel injectors, valued at $78 million on the sanctions market price sheet, hidden inside the hollow inner races of industrial wind turbine mainshaft bearings, machined cavities, foam cradles, custom-fitted for a specific propulsion system, the propulsion system of Iranian Kilo-class submarines, and the aging destroyers of the Iranian naval fleet. The paperwork was clean, the consignee was legitimate, the method was almost perfect. Almost. To understand how this operation worked, you have to understand what investigators were actually looking at when they pulled that container onto the secondary inspection pier. Evidence collection footage shows agents photographing the declared cargo, 640 industrial mainshaft bearings, each unit wrapped for freight. An agent stands next to one for scale. The outer housing reaches his chest. Forensic photography captures the inner race components laid flat on the warehouse floor, tags attached, a legitimate Kuala Lumpur manufacturer's mark stamped on each assembly. The kind of cargo a growing renewable energy contractor imports on a regular schedule. Nothing on screen would have flagged it. Surveillance footage shows the Georgia facility operating as a functioning business. Trucks moving in and out, employees on the dock, contracts posted on the company board visible through the window during the raid. Federal agents walked past 8 years of legitimate wind project paperwork spread across the office floor. Real revenue. Real clients. The courier arrest scene outside captures workers who had no idea they were part of it. A functional business generates no secondary scrutiny. That was the design. The shipping documentation matched the cargo. The manufacturer's certifications matched the bill of lading. The weight listed on the manifest was wrong by 6%, but nobody expected a CBP officer with a density console to catch that. Except that is exactly what happened. The borescope inspection took 40 minutes. The operative ran the probe through the drain plug access point of a single bearing unit selected from the flagged container. At depth, the probe camera found something that should not have been there. A machined cylindrical cavity, approximately 160 millimeters in diameter and 380 millimeters deep, cut into the inner race of the bearing. Inside, 4 precision machined injector units seated in individual foam cradles, each injector factory clean. No serial numbers, no country markings. The bearing cavity had been machined after the original manufacturing process. The cut was clean enough to be invisible on standard X-ray. The density differential was the only physical signature remaining, and it was only detectable against a precise baseline figure for that specific bearing model under that specific packing configuration. The CBP officer had that baseline figure because he had run the same cargo type twice before in the past 14 months. Dash camera footage from the port approach shows the same unmarked sedan that flagged this container on a prior rotation. The stop was not random. The agent behind the wheel had worked this corridor for 11 years. The hit came from pattern recognition built across hundreds of prior inspections. HSI Savannah took the file within 48 hours of the inspection. The injectors were photographed, cataloged, and sent for technical analysis. The analysis confirmed what the cavity dimensions already suggested. Precision machined fuel injectors of a type restricted under current export control regulations, specifically because they are compatible with the propulsion plants of Kilo-class diesel-electric submarines and the fleet's Alvand-class frigates and older destroyers. The Iranian naval fleet had been struggling with propulsion maintenance since the tightening of international sanctions. Spare parts for these systems were not available through any legitimate procurement channel. The gray market price for restricted injectors of this specification ran at approximately $132,000 per unit, 592 units. The math produced a number that changed the classification of this case overnight. I spent time going through the case timeline, and one detail kept nagging me. The operation had been running since late 2024. That meant 3 prior shipments had cleared Savannah without any anomaly flag. Same port, same terminal, same cargo type. This was not a first attempt. This was an established pipeline, and it had worked. In interrogation room footage, agents lay photographs across the table. Warehouse addresses, registered recipients, delivery logs. The suspect's eyes move across them. The question on the board behind the two-way mirror. Who was waiting for this cargo on the other end? The Georgia contractor was the obvious place to start looking. But HSI moved carefully. A direct approach to the consignee would expose the investigation before the receiving network could be mapped. Instead, HSI and NCIS agreed on a controlled delivery. The shipment would be held under a cover explanation, and the investigation team would work backwards from the consignee, looking for the point at which the pipeline actually separated the injectors from the legitimate bearing cargo. Controlled delivery operations of this type require exact coordination. The target shipment had to remain physically accessible to the investigation team while appearing to the receiving end as a standard customs hold. Every contact the consignee made regarding the delay was monitored. Every phone call, every email exchange, every third-party inquiry. What emerged within the first 10 days was a structural picture that had not been visible from the manifest data alone. The Georgia contractor was not involved. Its employees were pursuing the shipment through normal commercial channels, pressing their freight broker for a resolution, following up with the shipping agent. Standard business behavior. The company had received 3 prior shipments. Each one had been processed by the same Charleston-based logistics brokerage, a subcontracting firm the Georgia company had used for 4 years. And in each of those prior shipments, one specific pallet had been handled differently from the rest, not redirected at the destination, intercepted in transit. The logistics broker in Charleston had access to the Georgia contractor's shipment routing data because the contractor trusted them with it. That access allowed the broker to identify in each inbound shipment the one pallet on which the injectors had been concealed. That pallet would be pulled from the standard delivery sequence on a procedural pretext, a customs documentation hold, a carrier substitution, a weight recheck. The Georgia contractor never saw it arrive. The Georgia contractor never noticed because the contract price for the bearing shipment was paid by the supplier and the contractor received the quantity it expected. One pallet short, but adjusted in the documentation before final delivery. The missing pallet each time went to a warehouse facility outside Houston, Texas. The HSI team in Savannah coordinated with HSI Houston and a technical support element from NCIS to establish surveillance on the Houston warehouse within 3 weeks of the initial flag. The facility was registered to a freight consolidation company with addresses in 3 states. The warehouse itself was unremarkable, a standard tilt-wall industrial unit in a light industrial corridor northwest of the city. 2 truck bays, exterior cameras, a small staff of 3 to 5 personnel depending on the day. Over a 4-week surveillance window, the Houston team logged 22 inbound freight movements and 14 outbound. The outbound shipments were more interesting. 3 of them moved to addresses at the Port of Houston. 1 moved to a commercial cargo facility near Galveston. Agents ran trace analysis on the outbound freight documentation. The destination names were different on each shipment. The ultimate consignees, when investigators traced the paper trail far enough, resolved to entities in 3 different countries. None of them Iran directly. 2 were in the UAE. 1 was in Oman. That is how restricted components move when they move, not in a straight line, never from point A to point B. Through intermediary jurisdictions with weaker enforcement coverage, through trading companies with no obvious connection to the end user, through freight forwarding chains designed to make the provenance untraceable by the time the component reaches its final destination. NCIS had seen this routing architecture before, so had the broader sanctions enforcement community. The UAE and Oman had been flagged repeatedly in federal enforcement reporting as transshipment hubs for Iran-bound restricted goods. The components do not declare their destination. They declare a commercial buyer. The commercial buyer receives them and moves them again. What stands out about this case is the sheer infrastructure behind moving 592 fuel injectors across the Pacific through a legitimate manufacturing chain into the hull of a modified bearing, past 3 prior inspections, and halfway across North America before a single person noticed. This was not improvised.
Wow.
Someone with significant procurement and logistics expertise engineered this specifically to survive the inspection environment at a major U.S. port. If you have ever tried to ship a single commercial package internationally and dealt with customs paperwork, consider what it would take to engineer this pipeline at scale. 3 successful shipments before the first flag, 3 cycles of this same process working exactly as designed. The 5-week controlled delivery window closed on August 11, 2026. Warrant packages for simultaneous execution had been prepared by the HSI Savannah and HSI Houston field offices, reviewed by federal prosecutors in both the Southern District of Georgia and the Southern District of Texas. 7 named individuals were included across 4 locations: the Charleston brokerage office, the Houston warehouse facility, and 2 residential addresses connected to individuals identified during the surveillance phase. But here is where it got complicated. 14 hours before execution, surveillance on the Houston warehouse noted an anomaly. A cube van had arrived after midnight and departed 2 hours later carrying what appeared to be several freight pallets. This was outside the logged pattern. The Houston team ran immediate trace on the vehicle, registered to a leasing company. The leasing company had no record of an active rental on that plate. The plate was fictitious. The van had been staged. The investigation team had two options: advance the warrant execution immediately before whatever had just been removed from the Houston facility could disappear further into the distribution chain, or hold the timeline and attempt to locate the van, risking that additional evidence could be removed overnight. HSI made the call at 4:47 a.m. Execution moved to first light August 12. This is the part that does not sit neatly in any case timeline. Moving a federal warrant execution up by 24 hours across two jurisdictions in the middle of the night without compromising either team's operational security is not a procedural exercise. It is an improvisation conducted under direct pressure with no margin for error. Both the Charleston and Houston teams had to be notified, briefed on the change, and in position before sunrise without any external communication that could be monitored by the targets. At 6:14 a.m. on August 12, 2026, HSI and CBP agents entered the Charleston brokerage office simultaneously with HSI agents and a NCIS technical team entering the Houston warehouse. Law enforcement personnel were in position at both residential addresses. The Charleston entry took 11 minutes. 3 individuals were present. The principal of the brokerage, a 44-year-old logistics manager who had operated the firm for 6 years, was arrested without incident at his desk. 2 employees were detained for questioning. Document seizure teams moved immediately through the office files, pulling shipping records, communications archives, and financial documentation. Houston required more time. The warehouse entry encountered a locked secondary door on the interior that was not shown on the building permit diagrams the team had used for planning. Agents held position for 9 minutes while a cutting team worked the lock. Behind it, a separate storage area, approximately 200 square meters, not visible from the main floor. Inside were freight pallets stacked floor to ceiling. On the pallets, bearing assemblies identical in external appearance to the ones in the seized container at Savannah. The bearing assemblies in the secondary storage area were not from the current shipment. They were from prior shipments. Forensic analysis would later confirm that 148 of the 640 bearings in the Savannah container had been fitted with machined cavities. The Houston secondary storage contained bearing units from what appeared to be at least 2 prior shipment cycles, some of which had already been emptied. The injectors removed from those prior cycles were not recovered in the Houston seizure. Their location is not publicly known. Federal agents spread the manifest across the interrogation room table, circling line items, cross-referencing shipping codes. The paperwork offered no answer. The interview continued. 592 injectors recovered from the current Savannah shipment. An unknown additional quantity from prior cycles moved through the pipeline, through the transshipment network, and into a destination chain that investigators have not been able to fully trace. 7 individuals were arrested across the 2 locations and 2 residential addresses. The principal of the Charleston logistics brokerage. 2 warehouse managers at the Houston facility. 2 individuals identified as freight documentation specialists who had prepared the false manifest amendments that disguised the pallet redirections. 1 individual identified as the operational coordinator of the Houston storage operation. A 7th individual, arrested at a residential address in the Houston metro area, whose specific role has not been detailed in publicly available charging documents. The charges filed include conspiracy to violate the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, conspiracy to export controlled defense articles in violation of the Arms Export Control Act, money laundering conspiracy, and wire fraud. The sentences on these charges, if the defendants are convicted, run to decades. Here is the take that will probably generate some pushback. The sentences available under IEEPA and AECA violations are substantially lower than what would apply to equivalent drug trafficking offenses of similar market value, $78 million on the sanctions market price sheet. A comparable fentanyl seizure would carry mandatory minimums that dwarf what these defendants face, whether that reflects an appropriate calibration of the legal framework for sanctions evasion or a structural gap in how federal law treats national security threats that do not involve a controlled substance, is a genuine policy question the enforcement community has debated internally for years. The Malaysian manufacturer, whose bearing assemblies were used as the concealment platform, has been designated as a cooperating witness. The manufacturing firm itself is not facing charges. The investigation team's conclusion is that the machining of the internal cavities was performed downstream of the manufacturing process after the bearings left the Kuala Lumpur facility. The cavities were not machined at the factory. They were machined somewhere in the transshipment chain, using equipment precise enough to produce cuts that would not register on standard customs X-ray at the loading port. Where specifically that machining occurred has not been publicly confirmed. What do you think? Does the discovery of 3 prior successful shipments point to a systemic inspection failure at Savannah, or is the density baseline methodology that finally caught this shipment evidence that the system was working as intended? One detail from the case timeline that stuck with me is the role of the CBP officer's institutional memory. He had run bearing shipments from the same manufacturer category twice before. He knew what the density profile looked like. The concealment method was physically undetectable on standard X-ray. The only way it was ever going to be caught was by an inspector with enough baseline familiarity with the cargo type to recognize that the number on the console was wrong by 6%. That is a thin margin. And the people who designed this concealment method almost certainly calculated that it was thin enough to be comfortable. 3 prior cycles. 3 times it worked. The 4th time, one officer caught a 6% variance on a density console. The network that ran this pipeline has been disrupted. 7 people are in federal custody. The Charleston brokerage no longer exists as an operational entity. The Houston warehouse is under federal seal. The injectors recovered at Savannah are in federal custody. The injectors from prior cycles are somewhere else. How many prior cycles there were beyond the 3 investigators have documented is not publicly known. Whether the transshipment network that received the components from Houston has been dismantled, or whether it remains operational with a disrupted supply line is not publicly known. Body camera footage from the warehouse inspection shows the agent pausing at the scale readout, running the numbers a second time, 6%. Most inspectors wave that through. The demand for restricted marine propulsion components does not expire because one pipeline was shut down. The engineering that went into this concealment method did not disappear when the warehouse was raided. The next version of this operation will have studied what went wrong with this one. Subscribe now so you do not miss our next investigation. There is more to this story than one port inspection. The port is open again, the radiation portal is still running, and somewhere in the documentation chain there are questions that the 7 individuals in custody have not yet answered.